Welcome to Lecture 1 of Unit 4. So to start off, just some things that we're going to be having upcoming assignment-wise. So this week we're going to have the macrobiodiversity lab. We're going to be doing that on Thursday's class period. We'll also have the Unit 3 reflective writing, so evolution writing, that's due this Friday at 11 p.m. Then early next week we're going to have homework 1 due, so that'll be due Monday. That'll cover lectures 1 and 2. And then next Tuesday's class, we'll be doing the microbiodiversity lab. And that's our last lab for the semester. So, of course, Unit 4 is our last unit. And after that, we're going to work on these science and society projects. And so we're on the home stretch now. So let's go ahead and finish strong. So for today, what we're going to cover is biodiversity. And so we're going to talk about just kind of an introduction to biodiversity, what biodiversity is, and then we'll also talk about why it's important and kind of just break down some of the various things that make up the field of biodiversity. So biodiversity as a concept is pretty simple. As we know, biology is diverse, and so I think this is a pretty logical follow-up to our last unit because evolution, of course, we learned leads to speciation, which has basically created all of the biodiversity that we see on Earth. And so we have these 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And of course, within each of these domains, there is tremendous biodiversity and a lot of different interesting organisms within each. And as we talked about in the evolution section, each of these derives from a single common ancestor that traces back billions of years. And so again, evolution has produced this remarkable diversity of life on Earth. And it's pretty easy to see evidence of biodiversity, even just looking in the kingdom Animalia. So we have humans, in which, we are, as far as we know, the most intelligent species in the universe. And so, fun fact, 1 human brain is thought to be more powerful than all of the computers on Earth combined. And so compare humans to, for example, the bony-eared assfish, which holds the record for the smallest brain to body weight ratio of all vertebrates. And so, even just looking at these 2 species, you can see that biology is tremendously diverse. And you can also see that biologists sometimes have a bit of fun naming things. So biodiversity doesn't just deal with the kind of differences between biological organisms on Earth. It's actually the study of that, as well as the interplay between all of these different species on Earth. And so within biodiversity, a lot of what we're going to talk about is ecosystems and how biodiversity supports and upholds ecosystems. So biodiversity deals with the transfer of energy between all these different species within an ecosystem and how they support each other and the ecosystem as a whole. So we define biodiversity as the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And some of the scientists who study biodiversity include ecologists, zoologists, botanists, biogeographers, and geneticists, and probably a lot of other different scientists, dabble in biodiversity as well. And ecology, then, is the study of the interactions among organisms and between organisms and their non-living environment. So ecology is one of the probably major fields that's going to be studying biodiversity. So some of the major questions that we're going to cover today, and kind of some of the major questions in biodiversity in general. First, why is biodiversity important? Then we'll talk about the hierarchy of biodiversity and its 3 major levels. Talk about how ecosystems function and some of the important components of ecosystems that keep them running. And then we'll talk about ecosystem services, or basically what do ecosystems do for us as humans. Okay, so we'll start with why biodiversity is important, and for that, we'll just play this video quickly.
Our planet's diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem like permanent fixtures, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can become deserts, and reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. What makes one ecosystem strong and another weak in the face of change? The answer, to a large extent, is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes. Species that lack genetic diversity due to isolation or low population numbers are much more vulnerable to fluctuations caused by climate change, disease, or habitat fragmentation. Whenever a species disappears because of its weakened gene pool, a knot is untied and parts of the net disintegrate. So, what if we were to remove one species from the rainforest? Would the system fall apart? Probably not. The volume of species, their genetic diversity, and the complexity of the ecosystems form such rich biodiversity in this forest that one species gap in the weave won't cause it to unravel. The forest can stay resilient and recover from change. But that's not true in every case. In some environments, taking away just one important component can undermine the entire system. Take coral reefs, for instance. Many organisms in a reef are dependent on the coral. It provides key microhabitats, shelter, and breeding grounds for thousands of species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Corals also form interdependent relationships with fungi and bacteria. The coral itself is a loom that allows the tangled net of biodiversity to be woven. That makes coral a keystone organism, one that many others depend on for their survival. So what happens when destructive fishing practices, pollution, and ocean acidification weaken coral or even kill it altogether? Exactly what you might think. The loss of this keystone species leaves its dependents at a loss too, threatening the entire fabric of the reef. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity together form the complex tangled weave of biodiversity that is vital for the survival of organisms on Earth. We humans are woven into this biodiversity too. When just a few strands are lost, our own well-being is threatened. Cut too many links, and we risk unraveling it all. What the future brings is unpredictable, but biodiversity can give us an insurance policy, Earth's own safety net, to safeguard our survival.
All right, so just to kind of summarize a few things about why biodiversity is important, and we're actually going to come back to a lot of the concepts that were presented in that video. But firstly, biodiversity strengthens and upholds entire ecosystems. So each species within an ecosystem is oftentimes important for the survival of other species, and certain species are really critical for the survival of basically the entire ecosystem. So we as humans then depend on biodiversity for a lot of resources like food and carbon-based materials, of course, and basically a lot of other things. And what we call these are ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are basically what ecosystems do for us as humans. And so for these reasons, understanding the hierarchy of biodiversity and the interplay of the species within these ecosystems is really crucial for our conservation efforts. So what is the hierarchy of biodiversity? So it goes something like this. It's kind of just the different levels and breaking down the diversity at each stage kind of these ecosystems. So we start from the biosphere, which is basically all organisms living on Earth, and we go all the way down to the genetics of individual organisms. So let's just run through this real quick. So the biosphere again comprises all living organisms on Earth and their environment. A biome then is a major life zone defined by its vegetation or characteristics. So some examples of biomes, and this is from your textbook. So we have, things like the taiga, tundra, and I'm sure you guys have learned these things before, but tropical forests, deciduous forests, freshwater and oceanic environments, desert, grassland, savanna, etc. So basically the biome is talking about the vegetation and other sort of geographical, structural, physical locations in which life is upheld. And so an ecosystem then is a community of organisms together with their environment. So the biome deals with the vegetation and structure of the environment, and then the ecosystem deals with that and the life within it. Within ecosystems, we have communities, which are populations of different species in the same area. And so within these communities, we have, food webs. And so this is kind of what we think about at this community level. And we'll talk a little more about the flow of energy through an ecosystem, but this is kind of an example of a food web. Vegetation's eaten by the primary consumers, which are then eaten by secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, and so on. And so this is what we talk about when we're talking about the community level. A species then is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations. So of course we learned a lot about species in the evolution section. So one interesting question that biodiversity might deal with is how many species actually exist on Earth. So to date there have been around 1.4 million species described, and these include 750,000 insects. So there are a whole lot of insects on Earth. I'm sure you've probably noticed, probably been annoyed by them at various times. 250,000 different plants and bryophytes, and then around 41,000 vertebrate species. So E.O. Wilson is an important figure in the biodiversity field, and he estimates that the actual number of species is between 5 to 100 million species. And so we've probably discovered only about 10% or maybe less than that of the species that actually exist on Earth. So a population then is a group of interacting individuals of the same species in a particular area. And so within an ecosystem, there can be, individual populations of these species that exist. An organism, of course, is an individual member of a given species. And then genes, as we know, are a unit of genetic information that encodes a gene product. So generally, protein or RNA, something that is created from the DNA. So of these different levels within this hierarchy of biodiversity, there are basically what we consider to be 3 major levels of biodiversity. And so you might have noticed this mentioned in the video, but the 3 major levels are the ecosystem level, species level, and genetic level. And so ecosystem diversity talks about the different ecosystems within a given region. So for example, on a mountain, as you ascend a mountain, you may find different vegetation and sort of forests as you go up. And then as well on a mountain, you'd also find probably stream, rivers, maybe ponds, and rocky environments. And so each of these is going to create kind of its own ecosystem with different types of species within them and different interplay of those species that uphold these ecosystems. Species diversity then talks about the number of species and the abundance of those species within a given community or ecosystem. And so, of course, each ecosystem is going to support a different set of species and different abundance of those species within it. And genetic diversity talks about the differences in the genetic makeup between individuals of a given species or between different species within the community or ecosystem. And so usually when we're going to talk about genetic diversity, what we're going to be talking about is kind of how diverse a population of a specific species within an ecosystem is. And so genetic diversity is important, as we know, because it enables basically the natural variation that natural selection can act on. And so having that variation within a population is important for that population to face basically future threats that may come from like climate change or other things that shift the balance of an ecosystem. So in order for a species to be able to adapt, it needs to have a good amount of genetic diversity in order to have this variation for natural selection to act on. So within ecosystems, of course, there are these food chains, which are made up of producers and consumers. And so producers are basically autotrophic organisms or photosynthetic organisms that can obtain energy directly from sunlight using photosynthesis. And producers then are consumed by consumers, which are heterotrophic organisms that eat organisms lower on the food chain to obtain energy. And so there are different levels of consumers. There are primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, which basically eat things at multiple levels on the food chain. And so primary consumers, of course, are eating the producers, and secondary consumers are eating the primary consumers, and so on. And decomposers then are organisms that consume and break down nutrients from dead organisms, which then aid the nutrient cycle. And so within ecosystems, of course, we have this, we have these nutrient and energy flows as energy is first harvested from the sun, basically, by these producers, which are then eaten by primary consumers, and primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, and so on. And then as these organisms are constantly dying, we also have decomposers that are breaking them down and aiding this nutrient cycle, such that the producers can then harvest the nutrients from dead organisms as this cycles through. And so as energy flows through these food chains, energy is actually lost at each step, basically, as it flows through this ecosystem. So we have all energy within an ecosystem initially coming from the sun, which is basically synthesized by photosynthesis. And at each step of consumption, so at the primary consumer level and the secondary consumer level, we're going to have a lot of energy that's actually lost. And so basically between each level, about 90% of that energy is going to be lost in each case. And so by the end of the food chain, really not a lot of this initial energy that was harvested is conserved. And so we're lucky, I suppose, that we get a lot of energy continuously from the sun. And so these interactions we've talked about, are crucial for upholding these ecosystems. And so that all plays into ecosystem stability. So ecosystems depend on the dynamic and complex interactions between the species that comprise them. And species richness, we heard in the first video, confers a lot more stability to an ecosystem. So this next video is going to break down kind of a little more of how that, basically how these having more species richness actually confers that stability to an ecosystem.
If we think about our biodiversity tutorials as an archipelago, then today we visit this island to discover why biodiversity is so important. In terms of biodiversity, we mean a lot of different things. In this case, we're going to talk about something that's known as species richness, because that's something that we can measure. Because counting up the number of species, going out and finding out how many species there are in a given environment, is something that we can actually do. There are different species of plants, there are many different species of animals, many different species of microbes, and many different species of fungi. And they all interact in their environment to create what we would call an ecosystem. Eco is an interesting word. It's an ancient word that means house. So it's a system of what goes on in your house, that is, where we all live. All of these different organisms are interacting. They're behaving together. They're interacting with one another. Some of them eat each other. Some of them eat what others decompose into. And they, plus the physical environment, or the house, form the ecosystem. Why would the number of species, in other words, species richness, be crucial to the way an ecosystem functions? What is it about the number of species that makes the ecosystem work better and contribute to the resiliency or the stability of the ecosystem? Scientists are really beginning to study this, and the emerging field is referred to as BEF, Biodiversity Ecosystem Function. We can think of any ecosystem as species that network one to another. They have interactions with each other. They can be a lot of different interactions. They can live on top of one another, like certain birds nesting in trees, or even more crucially, these things might eat one another. This is a diagram, a network diagram of, believe it or not, a relatively simple ecosystem in which the organisms are interacting one with the other. We can draw lines between the species to indicate those interactions. And we can make the lines directional to show that material or matter and energy are moving from one species to another. When one organism takes a bite of another, it not only gets a mouthful of matter or food, but that food contains energy. So these arrows show the direction that energy is flowing from one species to another. The most important thing about these webs is that the strength of these interactions can vary. That is, the interdependence of the organisms in the web can vary. And here's something that might be counterintuitive. These interactions become less important the more species you have within a network. You can think of it as the interactions being spread among more players. But what happens when there are fewer players? Let's say we've got a really super simple set of interactions where this owl is eating that mouse, but can also eat this squirrel. This gives the owl options. If we remove one of these, take that guy right out of there, then we only have two species that are interacting with each other. And it's really easy to disturb this system. This guy will just eat all of these guys and boom, you can cause total ecological collapse. So the higher the biodiversity or species richness in a system or in a network, the stronger it is, the more stable it will be because of all the additional options open to the organisms in it. Think of that old saying about putting all your eggs in one basket. Not all interactions within a given ecosystem or network are exactly the same strength because some species have stronger interactions with each other than they do with some other species. For example, let's imagine that somewhere in here you've got one of these guys, and he's eating plankton, the microscopic organisms living in the water. Plankton are going in. These guys are the producer end of things, the ones who can photosynthesize and make chemical energy from sunlight. And remember, food equals energy. So what we're talking about is a lot of energy flowing from the producers to the consumer, represented by Mr. Whale over here. That's what these lines represent. They represent the flow of energy through the ecosystem. Eventually, the whale succumbs to life and dies, and poor Mr. Whale ends up on the sea floor. Are things over at that point? Definitely not, because at that point, he's going to give up stuff that ends up as part of the producer's food web. It's shown, actually, we're starting to get some really great new evidence, that these events where whales fall onto the sea bottom start an ecosystem of their own in ways. This is known as a whale fall. Don't get under one. It's always best not to be under one. But when the whale does hit the bottom, all kinds of interesting stuff happens. Lots of organisms come and feed on the whale. There's a succession of organisms, that is, organismal communities that change over time as the condition of the whale itself changes, that turn this whale from a fleshy organism to bones, and eventually even the bones are eaten. So this huge influx of energy that the whale's been accumulating from these producers, the plankton, that it's been feeding on, is returned to the environment, cycled back through the ecosystem. You might imagine that complex set of events that I just diagrammed here are part of this little bit of web. It turns out that where you get concentrated clusters of things happening in these webs, it's usually because energy is being run through the larger organisms in the system. And when you disturb a bit of that, where you've got large amounts of energy flowing through the system, you can get a real drop in ecosystem function. If you take the whales out of the equation, by overhunting them, you get this drop in ecosystem function because there's this removal of an entire major energy flow system from this network. Think of it a little bit like this tremendous thing that we have now, this internet. If you draw a diagram of the interactions amongst all of the servers and all of the things that push messages through the internet, there are places where that network's going to show a lot of stuff going on, a major hub in the internet. A lot of messages are flowing through. Like Google's servers, for example. Google is going to be at the center of one of these big clusters of a lot of messages going through. Other servers may not be so important. Those servers are going to be places like my desktop where I'm just messaging my kid to tell him to come home for dinner. If you take my server out of the system, it's not going to disturb the entire web. But you can see what happens if you suddenly take Google out of the system. You're going to greatly perturb that particular ecosystem. So these webs of interaction throughout an ecosystem are really, really important. If the system is bigger with more species and more interactions, you're going to reduce the chance that a perturbation or a disturbance is going to have a really negative impact, because you're just reducing the chance that you're going to take out something that's really crucial. The other thing about this is that all of these things are doing something different. They're all doing different things in the ecosystem. So if you imagine one of my favorite things, I love planes. Here's a complicated plane with 4 engines, lots of moving parts, piston engines roaring away. You've got a rudder here. You've got ailerons. Imagine this aircraft flying along. If you take out, say, the curtains that are in the window, you're probably not going to bring the plane down. But if you do something like remove a couple of the crucial bolts at the base of the wing, here where it connects to the fuselage, then the wing's going to fall off, and we're going to have a problem. Because before you know it, the airplane's going to crash. Same thing with the ecosystem. Everything's doing something different. Some things will matter more than others if you remove them. The more bolts, the better.
All right, so a couple of key points from that video. Firstly, as the narrator mentioned, this might be a bit counterintuitive, but the interactions become less important the more species there are. And so the more diversity you have within this web, the less important each individual node is. So there are more species basically to support one another and kind of perform these diverse roles when there are more species present, of course. So probably, multiple species will be doing the same thing. And despite the fact that they're each still going to be important, they're a bit less important in the case of more diversity. So then if you reduce that biodiversity, of course, then you threaten the system and the system could collapse. And so one thing that was also talked about in the video is kind of this key role of certain species within this web. And so we call these keystone species. So certain keystone species play a central role in holding the community together. So some examples of keystone species in the video, we talked about the whale, which was, this large animal that provides nutrients and creates a mini ecosystem when they die. And so the whale is important in that regard. It's also important, surely, for controlling the plankton populations. So predation is very important to a lot of ecosystems in order to maintain balance. Another example of a keystone species, I'm sure you guys have all heard a lot about this one, honeybees, right, as pollinators. And so save the bees is, of course, a big time thing these days because honeybees are crucial for the pollination, not just of some, natural flowering plants, but also they're crucial for our crop production. Wolves are another example of a keystone species. So wolves are another of these, predators that's very important for keeping elk and deer populations under control. And in that way, they can indirectly protect the vegetation so that you don't basically eat up all of the vegetation in a region. Elephants are another example. So elephants can eat small trees and other vegetation that might otherwise basically convert the grassland on the savanna to forest. And elephants, of course, are also a food source for large predators, and they play a number of other roles additionally. So hopefully what you can take from this is that these keystone species can occur at any level of the food chain, right? And so we talked about, in the first video, they talked about coral reef being an important producer keystone species. So at each level of this, from producer up to primary and secondary and tertiary consumers, there can be keystone species that really play a central role in keeping these ecosystems intact. So some threats to ecosystems, of course, loss of keystone species is one that can threaten an ecosystem because you lose these essential roles that they're playing, and basically, you lose that one of those central nodes, like Google that they talked about in the video. So loss of honeybees, example, again, would be detrimental to the world's vegetation and crops. And then similar to this, if you unexpectedly gain a species that an ecosystem has not co-evolved with, then that can also threaten the native species and the stability of that ecosystem. So an example of this, of course, is invasive species, and I'm sure you guys have all heard of different invasive species, but just a few that are important, especially in America right now. Asian carp, European starlings, Burmese pythons, and eastern ash borer. So I'm not going to run through why each of these are basically a threat to the ecosystems that they're occurring in. But if you want to, you can look these up, or you can just look up like most dangerous invasive species in the US, something like that. But one feature that these all share is that pretty much all of them were introduced to these non-native populations by humans. And so as global travel has increased, and basically we have multiple ways of transporting these different species to new environments, either accidentally or intentionally, a lot of ecosystems have been threatened by these invasive species. And so one thing to think about that's really important for this is that ecosystems develop over time, right? And so it's a lot of species co-evolving with one another. And so when they have the time to co-evolve and adapt to one another, then these ecosystems become very well balanced. But when you throw in something that basically other species don't have time to co-evolve with, then that can threaten the ecosystem. So there are multiple threats to ecosystems that are not just, within these biotic factors. And so basically all of these things with species that we talked about are biotic factors that influence an ecosystem. And so these are the living parts of the environment. So again, keystone species and invasive species are both examples of biotic factors that can threaten the balance of an ecosystem. But there are also abiotic factors, which are non-living factors that can influence the ecosystem. And so these include things like temperature, precipitation, and fire, just for a few examples. So of course, we talk about climate change, or in the case of the Galapagos finches, in different seasons of drought or excessive rain that, shifted their population balance. And then of course, forest fires are threats to different species and really change the dynamics of an ecosystem. So I was trying to think of a good example that kind of encompasses all of these different factors of biodiversity and kind of ecosystem stability. And so one that I thought of was New Zealand's kiwi. And so you guys have probably all heard of kiwi birds before. So kiwis are an endangered species in New Zealand, and their story is kind of an unfortunate synthesis of many of these factors that we've discussed so far. So kiwis evolved to this kind of forest floor dwelling lifestyle. So they're nocturnal animals, and they're primarily insectivores. So they're well adapted to kind of just, run around the forest floor and find insects on and in the soil. So they have this long beak with nostrils on the end, actually, so they can kind of hunt around, find insects within the soil. And they're also flightless birds. So they evolved without mammalian predators. So in New Zealand, there are actually no mammalian predators that would feed on the kiwi population. So that's not something that they had to worry about, evolutionarily. So when European colonists arrived on New Zealand, they decided to bring rabbits with them for hunting. And with no natural predators, the rabbit populations quickly exploded, and so the Europeans had to do more to control them. So their idea was to then release a number of predators, so like cats, stoats, ferrets, weasels, all these things were released into the wild in New Zealand in order to hunt and control these rabbit populations. And well, unfortunately, kiwis made an easier target than rabbits. So rabbits, of course, have co-evolved with these predator species, and so they have a number of adaptations to deal with that, such as their natural camouflage. They're really fast, very agile. And kiwis, alternatively, have not co-evolved with these mammalian predators, and so they don't have the same adaptations that rabbits do. So kiwis then were hunted to near extinction by the predatory species because they've not had sufficient time to adapt to these predators. So wild kiwi numbers today have fallen from basically before the introduction of these predatory species, more than 12 million to only around 70,000 today, and the numbers are still declining. So, of course, New Zealand has undertaken conservation efforts, and these include controlling the predator populations, as well as a lot of the eggs. If they find them in the wild, they'll actually take them into captivity and raise basically the kiwi chicks to adulthood in captivity to protect them from predation while they're young. And so one thing to consider within this, even if these conservation efforts are successful and we start to boost the wild population of kiwis, we've already reduced the genetic diversity within the wild kiwi population because of this population decline. And so reducing genetic diversity carries a number of risks with it. So for one thing, there's the risk of founder effect, which we've talked a lot about. So if you have just a small population of individuals that might have some negative traits, those traits unfortunately are going to be propagated throughout the population. Additionally, you might have less reproductive success once you've lost some of this natural variation and have more inbreeding within the population. And then, of course, the reduction in natural variation in the population is going to leave fewer traits for natural selection to act on. And so the population is going to be basically less well suited to deal with future threats or imbalances in the ecosystem. Okay, so to kind of summarize what we've talked about for ecosystem stability so far. So the species within communities evolve with one another to create stable ecosystems and food chains. And so this balance is created over time within these ecosystems. And more species richness then creates more stable ecosystems. And so the more nodes you have within these webs within an ecosystem, the less important the individual interactions become. And both abiotic and biotic factors are going to affect the populations of species within these ecosystems. And certain keystone species are essentially important for ecosystem stability, and the loss of these keystone species can threaten ecosystem stability. Additionally, on the opposite end of this, if you have the introduction of invasive species that have not co-evolved with the species within particular ecosystems, these can also threaten the ecosystem stability. Okay, so going back to why ecosystem stability is important, we talked a little about these ecosystem services, or the things that ecosystems basically provide to humans. And so, as we just talked about, loss of species and destruction of ecosystems is basically it's an ethical problem for one thing. So we talk about, like if the polar bears go extinct or something of that nature, of course it's going to be sad and we don't want it to happen. But additionally, aside from just kind of the intrinsic value and the ethical value of these ecosystems, they also provide crucial services that support our industries and human life kind of all together. So there are 4 types of ecosystem services that we'll talk about. The first is provisioning services. There are also regulating services, cultural services, and support services. So provisioning services include the goods produced or provided by ecosystems. And so this is things like food, fuel, fiber, timber, etc. So of course, ecosystems provide us just naturally with a lot of resources that we need to stay alive and for our industries to thrive. And so this could include also things like iron and different metals, oil, other things of that sort. Regulating services then are benefits from the regulation of ecosystem processes. And so these include things like water partitioning, pest regulation, climate regulation, and pollination. And so you've probably heard of things like, you may have heard of like ecosystems like mangroves, or can actually prevent island populations better from hurricanes. And of course, as we have more climate change, we talk about how the severity of natural disasters will only basically increase. And then there are cultural services, of course, provided by ecosystems. So these are non-material benefits that ecosystems provide, such as spiritual, recreational, aesthetic, and educational purposes. And then there are support services, which are factors necessary for providing ecosystem services. And so these again include things like the nutrient cycle and primary production. And so you should know these 4 types of ecosystem services and be able to recognize examples of each. And so here these are, some of these again in text form, if that's easier for you to learn. And with that, we will conclude today's lecture. And so a lot of this is probably, a bit intuitive, kind of things that you would know naturally. And so what's going to be important from today is just kind of to remember these key terms and examples of things that basically support ecosystem stability. And that'll probably be kind of a lot of what we do in Unit 4 is just kind of remembering key terms and key species, key characteristics, things of that nature, because biodiversity, is kind of something that we've probably learned a lot about over the course of our education, and just kind of something that we probably are a bit in tune with naturally. Okay, so for Thursday's class, what we're going to do, we're going to talk macrobiodiversity, or the classification and characteristics of what are sometimes called the greater eukaryotes, so animals, plants, and fungi. And then we'll also have the macrobiodiversity lab, and that, as usual, will be due on the day of class, Thursday at 11 p.m. And one additional note, don't forget to complete and turn in the Unit 3 reflective writing, which is going to be due this Friday at 11 p.m. All right, and that's it for today, so see you guys Thursday.